good morning. So this is a blended conference. Are we partly online for this session? Okay. Okay, so I'm honored to chair our first panel. We will be discussing contemporary debates in democracy and human rights. And what we're going to do is listen to our three presentations. I will also be presenting in this panel, and then we will open the floor for discussion after that. So I don't want to take anybody's presentation time, so let's start with Professor Levy.
Sorry, I couldn't hear if you've just introduced me. Is that right?
Yes, yes, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm just going to share my screen if that's all right. Okay, thank you very much. It's really great to be with you all virtually. I wish I could be there in person, but I'm in Australia's capital of Canberra and on Ngunnawal land, which I'd like to acknowledge. I'm talking about deliberative rights theory. So I'm going to get that working. Oh, sorry, can you see my screen? Yeah.
Yes.
It's just not functioning. Sorry, it's just not going. Let me just try this one more time. Okay, there you go. So I'm talking about deliberative rights theory. This is a relatively new line of research and practice of rights that connects theories of rights to theories of deliberative democracy. So, deliberative democracy is democratically inclusive, but it's also informed. It's uncoerced decision making based on mutual reason giving. So, why should we bring rights and deliberative democracy theories together? At least two broad reasons. First, we can better inform deliberative democracy because rights are often focal points for public deliberation. But conversely, we can also reread classic debates about human rights through the lens of deliberative democracy, and that's what I'll focus on today. So, in many rights theory debates, the question has been, who should adjudicate rights? Who can adjudicate rights soundly and legitimately? And for instance, courts or legislatures, these are old debates, but they have, as we've already heard this morning, actually, very new resonance amid global liberal democratic decline. And the legitimacy of public decision making has been challenged. Legitimacy is often challenged, especially for technically complex matters, socially contentious cases. Sorry, this is what I've been talking about. Now, uh, for example, COVID restrictions, abortion, climate change, terror, in all of these cases, at least two kinds of legitimacy are competing. The legitimacy of deliberative and technical inputs on the one hand, and then the legitimacy of democratic inputs on the other hand. And so in our paper, we call this the deliberation democracy dilemma. And that's because there's a challenge in that we need both kinds of legitimacy. In the absence of either one of them, we could encounter deep distrust, backlash, and even non-compliance rulings. Here's an example from Canada, from Ottawa during the COVID vaccine mandates and lockdowns that were protested by truckers in downtown Ottawa. These controls, these COVID controls, were notable in part for their complexity. The technical questions that they raised were beyond most citizens' expertise. That's because few of us are versed in virology or epidemiology or what have you. And so you need experts. But at the same time, we can't treat matters like COVID decisions or other technical matters, partly technical matters at least, as purely technical because they're not. there are also democratic value-based aspects that need to be weighed into the mix as well. For instance, in terms of COVID, the interests of people vulnerable to the virus on one hand, and then on the other hand, children missing school from lockdowns and so on, and also those whose work or philosophy or status or history of racialized relations with government inspired distrust in government measures in some cases. And so, again, we need democratic input to gauge these different positions and perspectives. And so, in many contentious cases, not just this one, but many, we have to try to make policy that somehow merges technical expertise and democratic input. And that's one of the great challenges that deliberative rights theory approaches. Can we do that through a deliberative democracy lens? So in our paper, we argue that deliberative democracy can actually be quite useful, both conceptually and in terms of practical institutional design. And we talk about what we call the integrative solution. So to integrate deliberation and democracy, if we could do that, would actually, to some extent, solve this dilemma. It's not easy, but if you can do that, then rather than clash, then deliberative and democratic inputs could develop alongside each other and in light of each other. And that's the high sort of normative ideal. It's far from easy, as I'll talk about. But one of the reasons why we think this is important is that we think that this normative ideal basically is missing in a lot of existing rights theories. So there are many rights theories, for instance, that try to blend technical expertise with democratic input. For example, Siegel and Post's democratic constitutionalism, which really gives a significant voice to the public in rights decision making. And then maybe most famously, dialogue theory, which imagines a conversation about rights between legislatures and courts. But what we argue in our paper is that a deliberative democratic lens is the missing piece in many of these theories. It's also a piece that's required to make these theories actually function to their full potential, I guess you could say. And to explain this a little bit more, you can essentially use, if we're talking about human rights theories, we can choose between agonism or deliberation. Agonism, it tends to be strategic, zero-sum, maximizing prefix values through the deployment of power and fixed interests. And so, for example, when it comes to dialogue theory, courts and legislatures can be agonistic with each other, which would mean that they watch out for and promote just the set of interests or preferences that they care most about. So, for example, courts might care about the protection of the weak in our societies against majoritarian democratic whims, which is a valid and important point. And the Canadian constitutional scholar Kent Roach says, for example, that judges should decide cases as they see them and let the chips fall where they may. But the alternative is a less sort of power-based and agonistic approach, one that is uncoerced, informed and mutual reason giving, and where ultimately you're basing your influence on persuasion and deliberation, which I'll talk about in a moment. But let me first say about agonism that agonistic courts and legislatures don't necessarily genuinely engage with each other. Ultimately, one has to have the final say, or one has the final say and runs with it, pushing that power to its limits. For instance, if an agonistic court either enjoys de jure or de facto power as the final decision maker, then agonist theory would expect the court to use that power irrespective of democratic views. And alternatively, if you have legislatures with the final say, as on the Commonwealth model of rights, then the legislature on an agonistic theory would have the formal final word and more or less be expected to dismiss judicial sort of perspectives on rights. And so there's very little on the agonist approach to suggest why rights actors will actually listen to or be swayed by each other. And, there is an exception. It could be that there's a form of bargaining that happens. For example, a court may need to meet a legislature halfway or otherwise risk diminishing its social license. But that's that kind of bargaining is based on power, and it's not the kind of interaction that tracks the sort of substantive merits of a case, which is what deliberation is more concerned with. So in practice, rights outcomes do not always simply track power. Crucially, though, agonistic theory can't really explain why. Why is it that sometimes courts and legislatures actually do engage in a sort of mutual influence? In a less power focused way. So this is what we're calling the missing piece in a lot of rights theories. So it's an essential question cutting across these rights theories. Do we take an agonistic or deliberative approach? So what is that deliberative alternative exactly? Oh, by the way, I should say that ultimately, if either the legislature or the court or some other rights decision-making actor gets the final say and pushes their view to the limit, then that recaps the deliberation democracy dilemma. We're not really solving it by having both take hold. We're actually just sort of choosing one over the other. So the alternative is a, a deliberative set of interactions. And this is something that we explore in the paper. And the key is that this is opposite to agonism. And deliberative democracy doesn't place deliberation and democracy in competition, but allows them to influence each other non-coercively from an early stage. And so one of the moves of our paper is to develop a set of sort of rules of deliberative engagement for rights actors, people who are engaged in decision making about rights. So first, you have reasoned persuasion. So this is something that ought to be the currency of influence between actors and rights decision making. They should exercise influence based on how informative their points of view are. And a key principle of deliberative democracy is that participants should persuade on the basis of the best arguments that they can muster, and not by status or power or other factors that Habermas, for example, describes as distorting communication. So there must be no rigid hierarchy of authority. Rights actors should not dominate each other. As a rule, instead, they should remain open to being persuaded by the information or the reasons of others, whether those reasons are deliberative and technocratic or democratic and value-based. Now, there's a big important exception, which is that sometimes courts do have to step in and wield power to check a legislature that manifestly abuses rights. And so that's something to keep in mind. But um, the frequency of that, at least in a country like Australia and I believe still in Canada, is not very significant. It's not that common. It happens, but for the most part, rights cases are ones of balancing. It's not a case of outright manifest abuse in many cases or most cases. Now, and that's my take based on practice and constitutional law and so on. So another part of these deliberative interactions, these rules of engagement, is epistemic diversity. You have to have many distinct perspectives and interests included in order to drive rights adjudication. This is deliberatively sound because it widens the store of insights that inform decisions on rights, including how rights decisions will impact on actual people affected. There should be other regarding outlooks so that people are open to recognizing the validity of claims of others rather than exclusively finding merit in their own. And actors should remain flexible and continually seek win-win outcomes, compromises, common ground, common values, and so on. And finally, there should be temporal deferral, which means that no single decision maker should impose a final decision until others have had a chance to make representations too. And even if there is a formal final decision maker, then that actor, the final decision maker, should delay in order first to take on board or be swayed by other views. So these are deliberative rules of engagement between rights actors. And this is something that we call the integrative ideal, because the idea is that deliberation and democracy inform each other as they develop, as these inputs from deliberation and democracy develop, they develop in light of each other rather than coercing each other after forming. So that's the ideal, the integrative ideal, where deliberation develops in line with democratic representations and democratic views within informed deliberative bodies. Now, the question is, how could we ever meet such a high normative ideal? And I'll consider two possibilities, courts and mini publics. So I'll start with courts. So courts, we argue in the paper, are somewhat suited to integration, the integrative ideal, but they often fall short. So early deliberative Democrats like Habermas and Rawls assumed that the courts in certain countries could serve as sites of reasoned mediation of democratic choices. So they could gauge the values of democratic citizens and then translate those into technically workable policies. And I suppose one of the problems with that theory, that early set of theories, was that these authors didn't know too much about the actual practice of law and litigation and so on. The trouble is that judge-led integration of deliberation and democracy, we argue in our paper, has a very large counterfactual component. So when cases are complex and contentious, they turn on chaotic mixtures of technical and value-based factors, and courts can't really know what choices citizens would have made had their choices been more technically informed and sound from the outset. So, for example, a court may assume that it can look at public views on a matter such as COVID, and it can assume that had the public just known a little bit more, had they been better apprised of the health impacts of COVID-19, for example, then maybe these deliberatively informed hypothetical citizens would have reached a certain preference, certain outcome in a COVID rights case. But we think that this overlooks how the value aspects of policy choices are deeply complex and subjective, and how data would have swayed the views of a more deliberative public can't be known as a counterfactual. It can't be hypothesized. It's ultimately what that means ultimately is that a court's efforts at deliberative democratic integration are mostly post facto and counterfactual, and they have a bit of an air of fiction, we ultimately argue. So is there, I mean, obviously courts are going to have to be important in the rights area. And so we think that courts, play an important role. However, mini publics are better in certain respects. So, for example, mini public is a deliberative democratic body that provides real-time integration of deliberation and democracy from the outset. So, as deliberative and democratic inputs develop, many of you will know about this. Ontario was one of the great innovators in this. You place a randomly selected demographically representative group of citizens together in an assembly. They learn extensively from diverse experts. They engage in facilitated, usually rather civil and reasoned collective decision making. And ultimately, we get a sense from them of how a non-elite set of non-partisan citizens actually think about an issue about which they know quite a bit. And so these ordinary participants still bring their own value preferences to the matter, but in the mini public, their choices are shaped by many technical factors that they learn about, and also by cooperative and collaborative reasoning and listening to contrary views. So, can this work as a model of rights adjudication? That's a question that Kate Ogg and I explored in our other article, and Kate will be presenting on that in about 6 hours at this conference. We wrote this with our student Henry Palmerly. We looked at 19 rights adjudicative mini publics, and we found that some of them actually worked quite well, particularly when they had explicit instruction on basic human rights ideas like proportionality or substantive equality. So, again, I don't want to discount courts. They might be useful. We talk about a number of cases where they're important in our paper, but it could be that mini publics are the superior option. In any case, as Gregoire Weber points out, it's not even clear that courts wish to follow rules of deliberative engagement. It's not always obvious that they want to yield up their own power over rights and share it with democratic decision makers. So we can't really discount the possibility of courts as actors who meet the ideals of deliberative rights theory, but newer institutions like mini publics may be more promising. So these are the two papers that I've been talking about. These are links with open access to both of them. And I look forward to the other presentations and to your questions a little bit later on. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you. That was an excellent way to get started here. And thank you, Professor Levy. And Now we'll move on to a very topical conversation about artificial intelligence.
Should I sit and present or?
It's up to you.
Is that right? Yeah, please do. I can control this. I should just present it. Just, yeah, sorry. Yeah. Okay, good morning, everyone. First of all, let me thank the Participatory Human Rights Cluster for having us here. I'm Leslie. I'm from University of Delhi. And my co-author is Dr. Abhiruchi Ojha. She's also from Delhi, from Jamia, Millia, Islamia. So our paper is titled Reconceptualizing Human Rights for the Age of AI. And what we want to provide you today is a global South perspective, which explores how what we consider as the human rights framework has to be fundamentally reconceptualized in order to address some of the changes that are about to be brought in by the age of AI. Our entry into this discussion is predominantly from our work on AI ethics, which we have been exploring for the past few years. Now, to begin, let me briefly now, AI, along with a whole host of other technologies, which includes Internet of Things, nanotechnology, robotics, is combinedly called as the fourth industrial revolution, which is set to radically alter the way we work, the way we, the nature of the job market, the nature of society, nature of politics, society, and almost everything. And if past technological revolutions have taught us something, it is that in order to make the transition into a new technological age more justified, more equitable, you need firm social interventions. This happened after the Industrial Revolution. Eventually, we saw the emergence of the welfare state, not because it emerged organically, but due to several struggles, activism, etc., which in a way enabled a more equitable distribution of the benefits of Industrial Revolution. And the same will be needed with respect to the AI age as well, if not more. Now, the AI era will give rise to concerns both conceptually, questions like who is a human or what it is to be a human, and also, of course, societal disruptions, socioeconomic disruptions, and even global questions about justice and equitable distribution. And the International Human Rights Framework has to sufficiently adapt in order to be able to address. Challenges at the societal level will be multifaceted, unique to each society. Like, say, for example, we are presently working on a couple of projects in the Indian context on gender and disability, where we have to explore the intersection with caste in India, where AI systems exacerbate existing social inequalities in the garb of a kind of technological efficiency or technological neutrality, which is very difficult to legally challenge in courts. So those kind of challenges needs to be addressed at the societal level, but still they would need, as we will discuss later in the presentation, global benchmarks, global standards, and global governance mechanisms, because especially the global South countries do not have the power or the means to control some of the AI companies or the ownership that is held by predominantly companies from global North. Then, of course, the emergence of non-human moral actors potentially in the medium to long term does also necessitate a complete reconceptualization of the existing rights framework. Now, our paper is not about that, but there's a lot of discussion on whether or how we should extend rights to non-human moral agents who might emerge in the short to medium term or certainly in the long term. My co-author was recently participated. She recently participated in the inaugural Kyoto conference on V-Turn, where Professor Ashwath Deguchi talks about how we need to have a fellowship model with respect to other non-human moral actors who might potentially emerge. So while there is that discussion, which we are not getting into today, so from this perspective, of course, it seems clear that we need a fundamental reconceptualization. If we are questioning who is a human or what it is to be a human, then we have to reconceptualize how rights need to be reframed to accommodate these potential non-human moral agents. But our submission here today in this paper is far more modest. Our argument is, even discounting that, simple socio-economic disruptions likely to be caused by AI in the global south especially. Now, this may not be a traditional global north and south, because if you look at the AI powerhouses, you need to include China as well today in one of the countries which is controlling the AI architecture. But more or less, the traditional global south and north, plus of course China maybe being part of the AI powerhouse countries. The kind of socio-economic disruptions AI is going to cause in the global south itself, we believe, requires a radical reimagining of the existing human rights framework to make it less state-centric and make it more redistributionary in nature. Right, because the present framework is more about based on state-level obligations, which many of the global south countries may not be able to fulfill because of the what we argue as the neo-colonial nature of AI ownership. Some have called it as data colonialism, whereby the AI architecture, be it the data centers or the algorithms, are owned by predominantly companies from the global north, plus China, and to a lesser extent, maybe India. Whereas the impact of these AI systems is going to disproportionately affect and threaten human rights in global south countries. And therefore, any potential redressal mechanism has to be done at the global level, because these countries on their own will be powerless to influence these global corporations who are controlling the ownership architecture. And that is why we believe there has to be a fundamental reconceptualization of human rights to make it less state-centric and more redistributionary in nature, more towards positive rights, more towards a sort of like a cosmopolitan sort of like collective cosmopolitanism rather than based on liberal individualism, which the current framework is. Now, I'll just quickly go through some of these disruptions which are likely to happen. We are broadly categorizing them as algorithmic harm, starting with algorithmic displacement. Now, several studies have shown that AI is set to replace most human labor, both physical and intellectual, creating, probably for the first time in human history, scarcity of work. Now, this is likely to happen in medium to long term, and the displacement and its impact will be disproportionately higher on global south countries because the first jobs to go will be low and moderate skill jobs, which are concentrated in global south countries. And of course, global south countries do not have adequate social security nets, nor reskilling or upskilling resources to manage the impact on their own. Whereas the benefits of the AI revolution will mostly accrue to a few countries, few AI powerhouse countries in the global north. So which means the global south countries won't have the resources to deal with this disruption. And of course, this will affect a whole set of rights. And unless there is an enshrinement of radical redistribution schemes, like a universal right to basic income, you would find the disruptions impacting global south countries in a very disastrous manner. And of course, a universal right to basic income is already being discussed in many countries, predominantly once again in the global north, who have the resources probably to do that even already. Which is why this has to be done at the global level, because the global south countries on their own cannot guarantee a universal basic income to their citizens. And this can be, the premise of that can be based on this emerging concept called data as labor, which basically argues that the AI systems are trained on data generated by citizens from across the world. They are refined by data. Every time you input something in your social media account, or you chat with ChatGPT, or even in your WhatsApp, you're training these AI systems. So that should count as labor. And so that's another right which we need to discuss about, right to fair compensation for data labor, which everybody everywhere in the world is doing, but the benefits are disproportionately going to a few countries. So the justification for the universal basic income can come from the right to fair compensation for data labor. Moving on, then of course you have algorithmic discrimination. Now it's well documented that algorithmic bias does exist, and it does exacerbate historical biases due to bias in data set or design issues or even intentional use. And the challenge here is because of the opacity of AI systems, partly because there is a challenge of explainability. We fully don't understand some of the decisions taken by algorithms, especially even in critical sectors like banking or even welfare or even surveillance, policing, etc. And partly also because the algorithms are copyrighted. They are the intellectual property of powerful corporations who hide behind intellectual property laws to prevent, to sort of like not explain the rationale of their algorithms. So which means it will create more disparate impact liabilities rather than disparate treatment liabilities. And the existing human rights framework already is more geared towards DT liabilities rather than DI liabilities. And this will, of course, have a severe consequence for AI because it will be very difficult to prove DT liabilities, especially because many algorithms are opaque. We can't show intent. Even though the International Human Rights Framework does talk about DI liabilities, if you look at the legal frameworks of most countries when it comes to compliance, except very few countries, maybe the US or the EU, as a region, you find very little in terms of DI liabilities. So, of course, this will affect several important rights. So we need strengthened AI-specific DI frameworks at the global level again, because again, national legislatures won't be able to make these powerful multinational corporations comply to their norms. You need to have AI-specific proactive human rights due diligence, which include algorithmic impact assessment, again mandated at the global level after a deliberative discussion at the global level, such that the AI companies can be held to account for discrimination. Now, moving on. Then there's also algorithmic manipulation. This is sometimes referred to as an emergent property of hyper-personalized digital ecosystems, whereby due to filtering, hyper-nudging, micro-targeting, where the algorithm may not have a malintent, but it's pushing you towards eco bubbles, filter chambers where you are liable to be polarized, radicalized, leading to what we see today across the world, right? Democratic polarization, where there is no malintent as such. The algorithm is just trying to manipulate you to make you spend more time on the platform, but it's leading to other collateral side effects. But of course, it can also be used by non-state actors and state actors intentionally, and that is where you also have concerns about algorithmic authoritarianism. So this can lead to erosion of, again, human autonomy, democratic rights, because the algorithms use well-known, scientifically established aspects of human psychology, like our confirmation bias, or even our fear of missing out, in order to fine-tune the algorithm to make us sort of like spend more time, which results, unfortunately, erosion of democratic rights, erosion of even right to information, etc. And but again, since it's an emergent property, one of the ways to address that would be to have an universal right to algorithmic literacy. We have, of course, right to education already part of the human rights framework. But today, more than just education as such, we need also algorithmic literacy. People need to know how algorithms work, who is behind it, the ownership model, how they sort things, such that they can make informed decisions. This can be modeled after UNESCO's media and information literacy paradigm, which is already there. And there are those who talk about right to serendipity, that we should enshrine a right to serendipity from our algorithms, but there are debates about how far that is possible. Then even, of course, right to data privacy, right to mandatory encryption of data, especially because of concerns about authoritarianism stemming from state actors or even non-state actors using your data based on surveillance to manipulate your behavior. So lastly, algorithmic weaponization. Now, this is, of course, more concerned with respect to international humanitarian law rather than the human rights framework. Many have talked about this particular moment as AI's Oppenheimer moment, where AI is getting weaponized with very little oversight and very little understanding of many of the AI systems, because we talked about the opacity in terms of how algorithms make decisions. Be it the Russia-Ukraine conflict or even in the Israel-Palestine conflict, AI systems have been used to select targets, And this raises very serious ethical questions about human accountability and who should be responsible to make the decision to kill another human. And also, there is also the potential Terminator kind of scenario where AI has the potential to be a runaway technology, leading to an existential threat, especially now that we are putting our weapon systems under AI. So we need to have a Geneva Conventions on AI weaponization to have a right to a meaningful human oversight of lethal autonomous weapon systems. So such radical interventions need resources and justification, and that is where we want to resurrect a very old principle, which is there in international law, the common heritage of mankind, or CHM principle, as it supplies both. Now I'll ask my co-presenter to on this.
I move with Haruki. Yeah. Okay. So common heritage of mankind is a legal principle that is based on an idea that we have global commons. Some of the things like the space, like the seabed and Antarctica, those kinds of spaces belong to everybody. Nobody really owns it. So it is, in terms of ideation, based on that idea. It's a legal framework, international legal framework, vis-a-vis all of them. So the key principles are non-appropriation, collective management, benefit sharing, peaceful use, and conservation for future generations. We are basing our idea based on these principles that are already there vis-a-vis AI, and let's look how it is going to look in terms of adaptation or tweaking it a bit. So when we look at non-appropriation, basically means that resources cannot be owned or claimed by any particular country. It has to be used as if it belongs to the whole humanity. The rationale for AI basically means that AI system is trained on entirety of human data. So one of the philosophers, Professor Gabriel, who's from University of Bonn, when he was talking about general technologies or GPT, it says that when you're chatting with it, you're basically talking to the entire of humanity, which is looking at you. The information, the knowledge, the epistemic position that it has of the whole humanity. So in that sense, AI basically is trained, and the entire humanity is there, and that has to be accepted. Data as labor, a concept that he has already talked about, has also gained very significance. So in that sense, there could be some companies that create AI, and basic coming up modeling can be done. After that, AI operates in a system where everybody is training. So in that sense, it has to be accepted as something which is based on the idea of the global commons. Collective management in terms of CHM principles vis-a-vis these three spaces or more spaces like that, like seabed and Antarctica, had very specific treaties that talked about how it has to be managed, or outer space treaty that is also available. What we need vis-a-vis AI is also something similar, which should have a global body that should be constituted, and that will so you have some things, some frameworks like UNFCCC and other things that could be set as an example on which this can be done. Benefit sharing is that in CHM principle, it means that whatever benefits, even in terms of research that is coming out of these spaces, has to be shared, especially keeping the global south in the mind. So benefit has to be shared to everyone, but keeping the global south in mind. Similar kind of things can also be done vis-a-vis the crucial aspects of AI in terms of ownership and development. But as of now, that doesn't really seem the case, because the benefits are disproportionately only concentrated in the global north, and the global south is only seen as a client that is using AI systems. Now, peaceful usage is something that anything that is in CHM principle on these territories has to be peacefully used, just to make sure that there's no weaponization. Regulating weaponization of AI is a very, very difficult task. Two of the wars, Leslie has already mentioned. The part that I came from, India and Pakistan, we also were very close to war in a recent scenario. So we know through our lived experiences that AI has already it's already on the verge of weaponization. And those experiences also tell us that if we don't do anything serious, and there have been some efforts in this regard that has been done long back, but we see no results. So more needs to be done in this area as well. If we are looking at conservation for future, this basically in terms of CHM means that anything coming out of seabed, space, and Antarctica has to be utilized in a manner that is sustainable in fashion. For AI, this basically means that we shouldn't really end up eradicating systems, knowledge systems that are already there, such as cultures, languages, diverse knowledge practices, and other things. I really have my clues, so I'm just going to come to a concluding point, which is that for human-centric AI development, what it requires is that we should have regulation that are embedded within a reimagined and a more positive human rights framework, which is more collective and redistributive in nature. And with that, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. This was a wonderful presentation. Very stimulating, very interesting. I hope we'll get a rich conversation out of it. I will now present my paper on Jacques Maritain. And I believe you'll see that he's touching on many of these same issues. What is a human? What are the foundational concepts behind what we're calling this human rights system that needs to be reimagined? How was it imagined in the first place? I think that this will, hopefully it will be relevant. Yes, it's called Realistic Idealism, Jacques Maritain, Democracy and Human Rights. So, Jacques Maritain, he is a French philosopher. He was operating about 100 years ago. And he had a large influence, a direct influence on, or an interestingly indirect influence, but a significant influence on the development of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But you probably have come across, if you are like me, this quote that's often attributed to him, which is that we agree on these rights, but on the condition that no one asks us why. Okay, that's a quote that I see in all the introduction textbooks on human rights, especially when we talk about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and how we got here, how we got these rights. Now, that quote has always bothered me. I don't know about you. It sounds like it's a little bit arbitrary. It sounds like let's just impose these rights, let's just go with these rights without really figuring out what we think behind them. And it reflects, I think, one of the basic problems that we've had with human rights thinking from the beginning, which is that there is this tension between what we think we know to be true and why we want to do it, and sort of the inability to solve that problem intellectually, in an intellectually satisfying way. So I took the opportunity of this conference to dive a little more deeply into Jacques Maritain, his thinking, try to figure out what he meant by that. Surely there's something going on behind this that I'm not getting. And what I found is a very thoughtful, sensitive philosopher who I believe does have something interesting to say. And I found that he's quite well known, was very famous in his time, for resolving complicated dilemmas like these between political and philosophical extremes, and for consistently advocating for robust, inclusive, participatory, democratic methods of solving our problems. So I thought he's the perfect guy to bring into this conversation on democratizing human rights. So I found that Maritain's position can be described as one of realistic idealism. So we've already seen, I think, a few times that when just this morning, that when we start to talk about human rights, there are these impulses. One is to go towards the highly ideal, to talk about universal ideals of justice and truth, dignity, human dignity. Now, if you take that idealistic side, you see these more realist-oriented people as lacking imagination, maybe narrow-minded, maybe cold-hearted. I'm not sure what other things the idealists would say about realists. But there's also this realistic side, which sees all that idealism as naivety, as simplicity. Maybe you don't understand how the world works. You don't know how politics work. You don't know how things work in practical reality. You don't have the experience. You don't know what's going on. They look at each other and have nothing but bad things to say about each other, I suppose. But there's obviously logic on both sides. There's a point to be made in favor of idealism and a point to be made in favor of realism. So they have to be reconcilable. Jacques Maritain offers us one way to reconcile this, and his resolution is to say, yes, there are universal ideals, and we need to hold them in a very careful and deliberate way as the guiding principles of our political action. But we have to understand the political world in which we operate in a realistic way. We have to understand the limitations of our imperfect human condition and our social environment and political environment. Now, one of those imperfect human systems is democracy, but Maritain defends it strongly as a uniquely well-suited political system to help us properly arrange that orientation towards the ideal from the real, let's say. So that's what my paper is about. That's what my presentation is about. I'm going to sort of unpack this realistic idealism that Jacques Maritain gives us. I'll try to tell you where it comes from, how it actually influenced the Declaration of Human Rights, and what it might say to some of the contemporary issues we're facing, which, as I say in the paper, actually aren't that different from the issues he was addressing. So I went back as far as I could into Maritain's extensive library of works that he's produced. And I found that even as far back as the early 1920s, he already had a fairly comprehensive system laid out of what I would call realistic idealism, with a clear idea of what is a human, what are human rights, what we need to do, where we're going, and so on. And it's interesting to me that he called himself anti-modern. Anti-modern. He also called himself ultra-modern, which ultra is the Latin for beyond. So you could say he called himself postmodern, decades before his compatriots, his French compatriots, Derrida and Baudrillard and Foucault and these guys got around to formulating their own critique of modernism. But it's interesting to point out that he was way ahead of them in isolating the liberal Enlightenment, materialist, individualist framework as, he would say, an error in terms of rights thinking. Okay, so he, if you want to look into this, it's a little bit of my paper, but of course his own work is much, he elaborates much more on this. His real targets are people like René Descartes, Hobbes. He goes after Rousseau. He goes after Locke. He goes after all of the big names in the early sort of European Enlightenment. And I think he comprehensively just leaves a wake of intellectual destruction behind as he goes through their works. Very interesting reading if you like the kind of critique of modernism. But for my purposes, I'll just focus in on his critique of Machiavelli, which he holds up as the origin point, let's say, of modern political philosophy. So how is Machiavelli a modernist? Well, for Maritain, Machiavelli, much like the other modernists he critiques, doesn't actually bring as much new to the table as he thinks he does. Maritain points out that political philosophers have been very aware, going back to Plato and all the way through, have been very aware that governments act deviously, selfishly, violently in the interest of a few at the cost of the many, and are very willing to lie and manipulate and oppress and everything else. That's not new. What's new is that Machiavelli, Maritain uses the word canonized it. He allowed it. He actually said, this is what's happening, so let's be realistic. This is what you should do. So let's be realistic about things. That's it's sort of accepting the divorce between ethics and politics as a matter of political right, of how to be a good politician, even. So it takes the idea of good, which used to be for Maritain an ethical question, and puts it into a political question. A good politician is one who has power. It doesn't matter how good you are, if you're not in power, you're not a good politician. So the first question is getting power and keeping power. Now, Maritain is not completely against Machiavelli. He acknowledges there is some truth to what to the realism of what he's saying. Governments do act like this. And that's why it is attractive to have someone actually call it like it is. But Maritain's argument is that it's not really realistic. It's not realistic enough, which I think is a very, nice way to attack the idea. He says, if you follow that logic through, if you say, okay, let's focus on getting power, and let's use deceit and violence and anything else to maintain power, does it work? Or do you fundamentally corrupt the political community you're trying to lead and undercut your own authority and eventually lead to your own unhappy downfall sooner or later? He argues that's the case, and he uses examples from his time to show that actually this form of government, this hyper-realist, anti-ethical form of government creates instability. Now, I think there are maybe some counter examples we can use to governments that have managed to stay in power a long time despite having little or no ethical sentiment. But I think his main point is true, that if you completely give up on ideals, you give up on truth and justice and so on, you're not going to create a very stable or well-functioning government. That's his point. He also accuses Machiavellian realism of being unrealistic in terms of its basic units. This is another key point, I think, and it's come up a few times already this morning. What are we talking about? What is the unit that we're talking about? You'll see that realists, even today, they often talk about states or organizations as if they are persons. Okay, so this is a confusion for Maritain. Canada that can't have a perspective on things. Canada is not a person in itself. It is an organization created by people for some specific reasons, but it itself does not inhabit personhood. Okay, for Maritain. So you're confusing the tools, the institutions, the creations of people for people. Okay, now that is a point of confusion that will come up a lot. For Maritain, it's very clear that is the road to totalitarianism. That must be avoided. So against all of that, against modernism, against that form of, he would say, incomplete realism, and I should say that in his critique of modernism, especially Rousseau, he also critiques extreme idealism. So against all of that, we have Maritain's personalism. And it starts with the inherent dignity of the human person. Okay, this is a key phrase for Maritain. It's a key phrase for the framers of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, who directly cite Maritain, which I found very interesting. And so let me just take a moment to try to lay out his concept here. He argues that the human person, a person, is unique in that it shares in the human capacity for reason and conscience. Okay, so can a state have a conscience? No, it can't. Can a human being have a conscience? Yes, they can. So what happens is we live on a time scale. We have a life cycle. So at certain times in our lives, we are not particularly capable of reason or conscience, but that doesn't take away from our share in the human attributes of reason and conscience. So we dream, we fall asleep, or we get sick and so on. But that doesn't actually remove us from our basic humanity. Okay, now that sounds very individualistic, but part of our basic humanity is our need to belong and contribute to society. Okay, that's part of our humanity. That's part of what makes us who we are. That's part of personhood. You can't separate the individual and the community, but you have to get that order right. You have to get the arrangement right. So he's very clear that the common good, the structures we create, the tools we create, are for the uplift of the human person, not the other way around. So what we have to see, and Maritain wrote a book on natural law and human rights in the 1930s that was very clear on this. It laid out its own Declaration of Human Rights of sorts, the first of which is human conscience. He put that as the first right. And then from there, he goes on to enshrine social, economic, and other collective rights because they're necessary for the full flourishing of the human person. But don't get that backwards, says Maritain. Okay, the main topic of our conference, I think, is democracy. So let's take a moment to think about Maritain's concept of democracy. It's related, but I think what will stand out when you read his work is that he thinks these procedural issues are secondary. Okay, he does engage in how exactly democracy works on a procedural level, but his interest is in democracy as a moral system. Okay, so he says that democracy uniquely allows for human reason and conscience to shape the laws that regulate society. Okay, so it's a moral system in that sense. Now, because we live in time and history, what happens is that if you get this right, if you allow human reason and human conscience to flourish in a social way and discuss and share, you start to get feedback and you start to gradually clarify, first of all, those ideals we're trying to achieve. What is truth? What is justice? And what the specific problems are that are facing our specific community right here and right now that need to be addressed in order to further reach those ideals. So he's balancing the local and the global here. He advocates for democracy on multiple levels, and he has lots of systems that he elaborates on to try to ensure that we don't slide too far towards the individual or too far towards the collective, but we keep things balanced and organized. Okay. I think that maybe we can address more of this in discussion, but I think that Maritain, if you take his ideas and try to apply them to today, you would see that he would have a lot to say about all of the dominant paradigms. He himself was very anti-modern, but he would not agree with the direction of postmodernism, especially its relativism, or any system that would denigrate those ideals of truth, justice, dignity, and rights, and reduce them to discourse and power. So I think he's making the same point as he would about Machiavelli. It's correct to point out that people misuse those terms. It's correct to point out that governments lie. They say they're saying the truth, but they're not. But that doesn't mean you should throw out truth. Okay. It's true to there are true statements, there are truths in all these positions that needs to be affirmed and pulled out, but don't go too far. That would be Maritain's point, I suppose. Because what you do is you enable pure power. You enable the Machiavellian divorce of ethics from power. Neoliberalism is still the dominant system, although it's we'll see where it goes. There is some truth to the goods that neoliberalism purports to bring us in terms of prosperity, but we will see that it's fundamentally subjects the human person to the anti-moral logic of the market, which allows it's extremely materialistic, it's extremely individualistic, it allows human exploitation. It does not uplift the human person in its core orientation, and it might lead us into some kind of technological feudalism or some kind of we'll see, dark apocalyptic Terminator style future very soon. And the major, let's say, competitor these days is a kind of a neo-fascist, authoritarian, collectivist reaction, which again rejects the basic truth of universal human rights, the dignity of the person, for these larger instruments, these larger human creations like the nation, like race, or any other group, any other subgroup that humans create. So his basic point is that social entities and institutions must uplift the human person and not vice versa. Just to go back to that opening quote about we agree on the rights, but not on the condition that no one asks us what, or but only on the condition that no one asks us why. I hope you can see now that there's more going on there. He's balancing the demands of action, of realism, with the need to carefully discuss the ideals, but he's sort of putting that off to the side. Let's act and keep the ideals out there. We'll figure it out as we go along. Another quote of his that I think gets closer to what I think he's saying is that it's not enough just to know what's right. We must seek possible ways to make it so. So both realistic and idealistic at the same time. Thank you very much. Okay, and now as chair, I will open the floor for conversation. Your questions are more than welcome, please.
Thank you all. That was really interesting. I thought that it worked somehow really well together. And I thought one of the ways in which they worked together well was that, I don't know if I would call it like a silenced reference, but what I was missing in all three talks, and maybe it's a matter of discourse or discipline, is talking more directly about populism and how populism changes the playing field, especially in terms of shaping the judicial systems or radically reshaping the judicial system, taking advantage of for-profit enterprises, and certainly in terms of what our definitions of justice and truth are. So just a general question to all three of you, if you could maybe more directly think about or say something about your really important research projects in relation to politics.
Sure, absolutely. Do you guys want to maybe Professor Levy, do you want to speak on this?
You're muted.
Sorry, I was saying that that's a really tough question. Is populism a part of judicial systems and practice, or is it that populism is a source of sort of criticism of judicial practice? You know, in a way, this is what I started my presentation with, this notion that we don't really have an authoritative, well-trusted way of resolving complicated rights debates, and I think that part of that is that there's this populist critique of, authority, and it's not all wrong. You know, to some extent, you can say that if elite judges are making decisions that are, reflective of them thinking that they know best, and excluding a sort of values-based democratic input into their decision making, then to some extent the populist critique of these sort of elite actors is actually not entirely wrong, I think. And so I think what we're focusing on in this deliberative democratic approach to resolving rights is how can we take away rights adjudication decision making from people who've arrogated too much kind of elite power upon themselves to answer some of society's sort of toughest questions. Maybe can we broaden things out, democratize it, in keeping with the theme of the conference, and would that answer some of the populist critiques? And I suppose I'm saying that to some extent the critiques are accurate. I mean, but often as well they're a little bit over egged. So I wouldn't want to sort of side with all of the populists, but some populists do have a point.
I can say, oh, sorry. Yeah. I can say that, Maritain would seek to find the truth as well. He would say, what is logical, what is reasonable about some of these populist demands and movements and so on, but where did they go too far? And of course, Maritain believes in truth. And we did see with, I guess it's an older reference now, but this whole alternative facts idea that came out a few years ago, which seemed to suggest that some people who were so committed to a political movement would, pick and choose what they thought was truth. And so a post-truth kind of political system, and we saw that with postmodernism as well. There's a kind of there's a willingness to be so flexible about truth that you give up on that concept altogether. And I think that's where Maritain would push back, and he would say, if there is truth in this perspective, let's pull it out and let's pull out the other truth and let's see what combines them in a greater truth, and that is what will keep getting us towards an ideal.
Yeah, with respect to populism, the comment I can make, which is directly related to a paper, is some of the populist movements of today are probably fueled by the kind of echo chambers which people live in, which is sort of like giving them access to their own truths or alternate facts, which they sort of like taken without any questioning. So in that sense, of course, we need to address that, how to overcome that, or whether it is possible to overcome that. But I think there's a broader point, which maybe not directly related to a paper, which I also want to make, is also about democracy. Like, I think I teach Western philosophy. Like, if you go back to even Greek philosophers, populism is a threat in democracy, right? It is a well-recognized threat in democracy. And in liberal democracy, we have tried to mediate that by having these procedural institutional frameworks in the middle to have a more elitist kind of perspective. But like the speaker also said, that's also deeply problematic. So it was not as if before the social media age, information was free or there was a truth. We talked about managed democracy going back almost 100 years back. So in that sense, The digital age has sort of like broke open the gatekeepers of information, which was the big media houses, which was also problematic. And like in the context of media, for example, the secular sort of pillars of India probably were never really taken to the people because it was only in the bigger media houses. And now when social media sort of breaks open those barriers, you do find a populist instinct in the other way. So in that sense, we have to address populism by dealing with the real people, not going back to a kind of like a caged truth. And that's where the first paper was very interesting, like trying to have a strike a balance.
Thank you for that question. Anyone else? Yes, please.
Thank you very much for the presentations. Not being an expert of human rights, I'm posing this question to what I would say the Rolls Royces of human rights, Prof. Ross and Prof. Ron. I don't know the extent to which you have been following the current situation in South Africa, where you see the very preachers of human rights being the very violators of the same rights. I don't know whether you've been watching the Mandlanga Commission. The situation now in South Africa, we've got a justice system that is captured by mafias. And you've got a minister who seemed to have lost, a minister of police, for example, who has lost, who says it's his constitutional right to encroach into the implementation of the policies by the HOD. So as you are presenting, I'm thinking about the situation to say, but now what is, especially what you are saying, if we were to go into the minds of Machiavelli and who's this other, Maritain, what would they say about the situation in South Africa now? You know, the mafias have captured the whole justice system, from the judges to the advocates to the magistrates. And you see cases of political killings where people who are killed, there's no justice. So what would you say about that? Well, we preach democracy, but at the end of the day, when it's got to be enjoyed by the very people whom it has been promised to, it's not happening.
Well, I would not make specific comments about South Africa because I don't know the case well enough, but it sounds from what you're saying that it is a classic case of Machiavellian power politics. And we know that part of the technique explained by Machiavelli was to use ideas like truth and justice, particularly explicitly to subvert them. So you appear to be caring when you're not. So it's the exact situation of putting the fox in charge of the chickens or whatever. The worst people in the worst positions for the worst reasons, but pretending to be there for public service and public good. And that is one of the dangers that Maritain is trying to address. And so he does say we need to insist on what we know to be right and good and true, despite the odds, because it is partly he would put it on the intellectuals not to promote that kind of deceit. So partly he's criticizing the intellectuals who have given up on idealism. I think he would call on anyone to do what they could to insist on democracy and justice and so on as far as possible. But when it comes right down to it, you push Maritain, he does his realist side does say that he is a just war theorist as well. He does justify resistance and the self-defense, the human right to self-defense when we are faced with extreme violence. But I don't know so much about the specific case. I would leave that to the experts.
It's a very interesting one. You must watch it on YouTube. It's still going on. It's just started now. but it's very sad
Mm.
in terms of what is happening currently. It's sad.
Can I chime in just quickly? I was going to say that, I think it's a really interesting question. What happens when democracy fails and is a source of, some of our biggest problems? I loved the description of Maritain's philosophy, and he obviously had a lot of faith in democracy. Ross, well, do you think that there ought to be, I guess, an addendum to his view that it can't just be any democracy that you should have faith in? There's got to be a certain brand of democracy. Maybe, well, I think in terms of deliberative democracy, but maybe some kind of institutional checks, some form of democracy that we can rely on a little bit more. So was he maybe a little bit naive in putting his faith in democracy when we look at South Africa or other examples where it's really it hasn't worked out? Is that something that's missing from his account?
It could be, but I think he's he has a very generous definition of democracy as a moral system. Any system that allows for the participation of the actual people who are subject to those rules would fit within his definition, because he's looking at conscience and reason and so on, rather than specific procedures. But I think that he would hold out hope. Okay, I'm reminded of the Bob Marley line: "You can fool some of the people some of the time, but you can't fool all the people all the time." He would take this position that yes, Machiavellian actors will get into power and they will try to manipulate democratic systems, but they can't do it forever. If we maintain what we know in our conscience and our reason to be true, and we continue to speak and to act based on those ideals, the arc will lead towards moral progress over time. That's the Maritain's politics of hope, let's say. Yes, please, more questions. Yes, please.
First of all, thank you to all the presenters. 3 extremely interesting presentations, very diverse. But my question, unfortunately, I just want to pose to Dr. Levy. And I hope the other presenters will forgive me. It's not a reflection on the presentations at all. But it's a practical one. I mean, I'm very interested in your theory of these mini publics and the citizens assembly model. And I wonder if you've done any, unfortunately, I haven't had a chance to read your full paper, if you've done any work on their limitations and any safeguards that we can introduce against their performative use by states. And I'll give you a context for my question here. In a previous life, prior to becoming a professional academic, I was living in Ireland for 20 years, and I was involved in parliamentary politics with a particular focus on full implementation of the Good Friday Agreement, and in particular, the human rights provisions of the Good Friday Agreement. And in doing this work, I was involved in 2 of these sort of mini publics models that were put forward, inspired by the South Africans, by the way, I should say. One was a mechanism that was directly embedded in the Good Friday Agreement, the Bill of Rights Forum, which brought together parties and civil society from all sides of the conflict in the North. And the other one of which was a constitutional convention, which was really a citizen assembly plus politicians model from all political parties in the South, to look at constitutional change in the southern case. And in both cases, while I was participating, I was really impressed. These models worked exactly the way that you indicated. It's education provided by experts and dialogue across that you come up with, that these mini publics come up with really excellent solutions, right? In rights adjudication, deciding on proposals that should be implemented. And in both cases, the recommendations of these bodies were stopped dead in their tracks by vested interests within the British state, for example, and those involved in the colonizing population of Ireland in the north, together with the British state, and in the south, kind of vested interests from within the establishment. So what do we do when we have these models that work exactly as you think they would? They come up with extremely impressive results, and these don't go anywhere. I don't want to feel pessimistic, but my own experiences kind of drive me in that direction. Can you lead me back towards hope?
Well, I want that hope as well. So I'm working on deliberative peacemaking at the moment, and so your experience is very relevant to that. And a lot of our authors in this collective work are Northern Ireland authors, and we're really interested in this question of whether mini publics can work. And there have been a lot of mini publics that have been quite successful around Northern Ireland and Ireland, in the sense that they do exactly what you expect. They give rise to understanding and mutual respect. But there's always the problem that you mentioned. Well, not always, but sometimes the problem that you mentioned, which is something that some people call the re-entry problem. So once you've taken a political problem and put it in a nice deliberative setting, where people were great to each other and learned from each other, then what? So the big problem potentially is that the wider, sort of harder, more Machiavellian sort of world of politics will just ignore it. But I guess there are two answers to that. One is that sometimes it works, and the reason that it sometimes works, in the sense that it actually convinces people to make decisions. So it convinces politicians to heed the mini public. The reason for that is that these are highly, highly trusted bodies, because they're both deliberative and democratic, right? So you can't complain like you normally can about democracy, that it's underinformed, but you can't complain like you normally can about elite decision making, that it's undemocratic. So because it has both deliberative and democratic aspects, it tends to be very well trusted. And from British Columbia to Australia, there have been studies to show this. It doesn't mean that it'll always work. It won't always convince political decision makers to go along with these decisions of mini publics. But at least there's a better chance, I would argue, that these highly trusted bodies, which have so much apparent legitimacy, will actually convince people occasionally. So, sometimes good things happen, and sometimes, the right decision is made. And it's a matter of not being too depressed by the many failures, and maybe focusing on those cases where it actually does work. That would be my answer to your sort of quest for hope.
Thank you. We have a question from Dr. Valid.
Yeah, I'm happy to be fair to others, but thank you all for great presentations. I think they all work well, and there's something to pull out of each and every one of them. But my question is to Professor Ojha and Professor Kumar on reconceptualizing human rights in the age of artificial intelligence. Fascinating talks that address very topical issues. So last year, over 100 world leaders gathered in New York for the signing of the Path for the Future. This document that was supposed to reinvigorate multilateralism, reinforce human rights, put the world again back on the path of peace. And a central component of that document was the Global Digital Compact, which was intended to address so many of the questions you so nicely articulated, making digital technology the common heritage of mankind and all of that. It's a beautiful document. It reads well. But of all the things that we outlined there, 1 year, I know it's just 1 year, really haven't gained traction. And so many of the solutions that you proposed seems to me very commonsensical. They're no-brainers. I'm wondering if you could reflect on what the key obstacles are, because when we identify what the institutional and structural obstacles are, then we can begin to think the with how to operationalize the solutions. So just a reflection on what are the 2-3 big obstacles to just making these happen, declaring AI a common heritage of mankind, fostering global cooperation, protecting the vulnerable, and making this an innovation that benefits all of humanity.
So we have to go back to 1992 vis-a-vis the environmental question. That's when the key turn takes place. And everything has gone down the hill that moment onwards. From common heritage to mankind, which was a tiger that could bite, not a paper tiger, with teeth. There was a dilution that was done, and the concept emerged was common concerns of mankind. So these are things that you ought to think about, and then you are at liberty to do something about it, but there is no redistributive aspect of it, because the biggest obstacle that came from the global north, and the countries were ready to sign anything that will make them responsible, take responsibility, and do something material about it. And the same CCM principle is that is being applicable on anything that moment onwards. So environment was one place where you saw in terms of global commons, which should have made common sense. You know, you can't breathe, you can't live, and you'll have a shorter life and stuff like that. Should have made people come together, but that's where this bargaining chip was done, and the sheer play of power you could see happening. From there, every other protocol that has to do with anything that is common, you would see the same technique being applied. And therefore, one of the arguments that we are pitching in this paper is we have to go before this moment. You have to revisit and go before UNFCCC if you want to do something substantial, because you need to have material aspects of it. So when you say that it has to be shared, it would mean something. You have to have a number, and you also have to have people that you're going to, make responsible to do that. So that would be the first thing. And this is both in terms of if you look at any aspect, including seabed, that is the kind of thing, navigation and arm twisting that was done on seabeds as well. So now you would have companies and sovereign states that become very important players in seabeds instead of the whole of humanity. You want to add something to that?
Yeah, it's broadly same as she said. I think the real obstacle is the Machiavellian politics overall, like the divorce of ethics and politics. And in AI, there might be sort of like more scope for hope, because there is, I'm forgetting the full name of the scholar, Bastan, who talks about universal basic services. He talks about fully automated luxury communism. So the surplus, the surplus is going to be potentially huge. That if there is concerted action from a variety of civil society actors, as well as, of course, both governmental and non-governmental agencies, you can potentially move towards a more redistributionary framework. And that's why the international, if it gets incorporated into the international human rights framework, it will give it more legitimacy, more validated. So right now it's part of the law, international law, that to barely hanging on, like she said, because it has been replaced by CCM. So that is where we want to move back to the discussion, not just on national law, but also with respect to human rights law. And in the AI future, without such redistributionary mandates, the rights will just be honeymoon with scarcity of work and all of that kind of. So yeah.
In a separate work that we have done together, we look at this question of that is on AI ethics. I'm looking at what does it mean to be human. So that aspect, it's a political philosophy paper that we have written. And one of the things that we are talking about is also mixing up two different thinkers vis-a-vis post-labor society. One is Marxian idea of superabundance that could possibly come from AI labor. And the second is Rousseau's ideas of perfectibility. So maybe perfectibility is something that we could arrive at with the help of AI. But if you don't really have a very strong legal framework that is mandatory and it's not just suggestive, We don't
Yeah.
see that happening, but not much is lost in case of AI because we are really at the beginning stage of it. And therefore, these discussions are, and across different disciplinary boundaries are very, very important.
I think just one last point, like going back to the Industrial Revolution, all the emergence of welfare state, all of that happened after political struggles. So I think that needs to happen for this redistribution to happen, but of course at a global scale.
So basically, if the rich get richer and the surplus, there's more inclination to be a bit more generous with the rest of us. Anyway, well, Jacob.
Andy.
Thank you. What an awesome panel. Thank you for sharing all of you. I want to ride on the last question about artificial intelligence and ask if you have any thoughts on how private ownership of these language models could influence your idea of global ownership. I know you presented it as existing primarily in the richer countries of the world, the global south disadvantaged, but in these places, it's still private businesses that are running, these algorithms. And in a sense, governments have really not much understanding of how these things work. You use the word opaque, and I agree with you, AI is very opaque. So how could the ownership of these things influence the possibility of global ownership for everybody, given profit motive that drives how these businesses run? And then I'm also curious to know if you have any thoughts about the possibility of humans becoming a minority, in the sense that we're having more and more computer-to-computer communications. AI is engaging and becoming smarter and learning and improving itself. Do you think there's a risk, for human rights, especially as they become more dominant in our lives?
Okay. Yeah, with respect to the large language models, that is quite a bit of concern, especially in countries like India, where there is a sort of like linguistic diversity. But the government-sponsored, I'll come to private models, but the government-sponsored large language models are focusing on maybe one or two languages, which are the sort of like the dominant languages in the country. So, which means, of course, that is why pluralistic development of AI, like in one of the conferences we attended, there was someone talked about Buddhist AI. So we need to have AI systems informed by all different philosophies in different languages in order to at least ensure that those languages are preserved for the future, because predominantly in the future, people are going to get knowledge, maybe not in universities, but through AI systems.
Yeah.
So the private ownership in that regard is concerning. I think that is why we need to move towards a CHM model, where we can potentially have sort of like a trusteeship sort of model of ownership, or maybe profit sharing, where there are clear demarcations of what you owe to the society, what are the guidelines. Like one of the examples, which is not, of course, a direct translation, can be with respect to how we manage nuclear energy. Right? There are private players in nuclear energy as well, but there are very strict guidelines because of the sort of like existential impact of nuclear energy. So in pretty much the same way, I think AI should be treated as something like that, where you do maybe allow profit. The reason I'm talking somewhat in favor of profit is because when we did this research for disability ethics in the context of AI in the Indian context, we were also surprised. A lot of civil society actors in the Indian disability rights movement, they're so optimistic about it. And they actually don't want government involvement because they think that government will stifle innovation and prevent these private companies from, and especially in a country like India, where the support infrastructure for disability is very less. They see AI as a potential leapfrog technology, which would in a way give them what the society has not enabled in a country like India. So maybe there is a rationale to argue for some amount of private control in terms of how it's run. But there's also a very strong rationale for public supervision of it, in order both in terms of how it is done and to preserve diversity and all those concerns, and also in terms of profit sharing, to make it more redistributionally, more just in terms of how the benefits are distributed.
So one of the things that we are proposing in the paper is regarding property rights, intellectual property rights in particular, but other things as well concerning private ownership, is that, the modeling coding of the data and training of AI is a place where intervention can be done. Because after that, how AI operates is something that even the companies don't know about. So you could train basic training, and then after that, what comes out is a process that nobody really knows. Even the companies don't have a clue about it. This is where you need participatory model. This is where you need intervention. So places like I know a bit about South Africa and Indian case as well. We have models where companies have taken up this initiative where they are proactively training the data sets based on the diversity and philosophical diversity, other kinds of things, arts and language, and doing it. But there could be a possibility of sharing at this level. If it is shared and if it's inclusive at this level, then the result is going to be very different from the kind of biases and the harms that we were, algorithmic harms that we were talking about. So that could be one way that we could, one way that we are proposing in our paper to go about. Yeah.
Yeah, to the second question, will humans become a minority? That depends on whether we would consider AI in the future as moral agents. I guess that's still open to debate in terms of whether AI can achieve consciousness. And I think it's something that's still being debated because first of all, we don't even understand what human consciousness is fully. Terminologically, what it means, we know, but what it means in abstract, probably we don't know. So in that sense, there are those who argue, like I talked about Professor Deguchi at Kyoto University, who says that we need to move towards a fellowship model, where we should have rights for other potential moral agents as well. And in that, yeah, that's a distinct possibility. We also have to talk about human rights vis-a-vis these non-human agents, how interact, and that will be an entirely different discussion, because so far we are the sort of like not just the right bearers, we are the only ones who are defining the rights as well. So when we have another sentient being, it's like basically meeting aliens, right? So what sort of rights we will have, it has to be co-created by the other sentient being as well. It's not like, say, for example, animal rights, where we decide what to be given to the other entity. So when we have other potential moral agents, I think the discussion has to be more participatory as well, provided if that's possible. And there are many who believe it's possible.
There are two interventions that I would like, and I know we might run out of the time. First is Donna Haraway. So if we look at the feminist sort of cyborg feminism perspective of it, a big chunk of people who come from the same school of thought would really not have a problem. They would say that we should rather embrace that idea right now so that we have a philosophical foundation to follow on in future. The second is more specific example. So in one of the cases, I think it was in the United States, where AI had given very specific ideas about how to commit suicide, and the child actually committed suicide, and the parents went to court and they wanted AI to be held accountable. Now, the problem in law is that AI does not have personhood. So whom do you hold responsible? And then if that is the situation, can AI also hold the human responsible? If you agree to this premise, then would you also say that AI can also, if AI has personhood and you can hold it responsible, can AI also hold you accountable for emotionally harming and stuff like that? So it's a very, very tricky situation where we are as of now. And there's a lot of plethora of work that we have also addressed some of these questions in our paper that we have submitted for the presentation.
I think we could have this conversation for the whole 2 days, honestly, and I would love to have it actually. It's I think that's like the key conversation of our time in a way is, is AI conscious? But it sounds to me like the old problem of Pygmalion as well. We've created a being and then we confuse it for ourselves. We're confusing the mirror image with ourselves. But let's call it and keep talking after our break. We'll talk over coffee. And thank you so much, everyone.